My name is Amelia Carter. I'm 39 years old. If you've ever spent nearly a decade building something that most people only see from the surface, then you'd understand how I feel. I was never the kind who liked attention or needed to be called a star in the company. I just wanted to do my work with integrity and see it matter. But in the corporate world, that's rarely enough. I joined Mason and Hartwell Logistics 8 years ago, starting at the lowest rung in operations. The company was a mess back then: broken distribution chains, delayed shipments, canceled contracts, and no one willing to take responsibility. I was the new hire, no family ties, no connections, just a bit of logistics experience from smaller firms and a habit of staying late. I believed that if I worked hard enough, someone would notice. I remember one winter evening, long after everyone else had gone home. The office lights were off when CEO Richard Mason happened to walk by. He stopped behind me, glanced at the spreadsheets covering my screen, and asked, "What are you working on, Carter?" Without turning around, I said, "Trying to figure out why we lose 3% of revenue every quarter just because of late deliveries." He chuckled. "You think you can fix that?" "I don't think," I said. "I know I will." 3 months later, I did, and from that moment, he started to trust me. I never had an Ivy League degree, but I understood how supply chains really worked and how people broke them through arrogance or shortcuts. I wasn't charming, but I knew how to make a system run clean. Bit by bit, I built a place for myself. By year 3, I was promoted to regional operations lead. When we landed the Atlas Industrial account, the biggest client in company history, Richard shook my hand and said, "Carter, you're the backbone of this company. One day, you'll be in the executive suite." I believed him. Back then, I truly thought that hard work would be enough. The company grew. 2 new branches, 30% annual revenue growth. I never asked for a team of my own, but I earned loyalty. My staff knew that as long as Amelia stayed, everything would be fine. I never demanded more than what I had, but deep down, I knew I had earned a seat at the table. Richard often said in meetings that I was the one who keeps the wheels turning. He said it warmly, as if it were praise. But sometimes, praise is just a leash disguised as kindness. The culture at Mason and Hartwell was no different from most American corporations. Proximity to power mattered more than performance. Those who played golf with the bosses moved faster. I didn't. I didn't go to cocktail parties, didn't joke around with executives, didn't call Richard rich like everyone else. I just worked. I believed results would speak for themselves. Looking back, that might have been the most naive thing I ever believed. Near the end of my 7th year, Richard began talking about Project Helios, a large-scale expansion to the Western markets. It was the opportunity I'd waited 8 years for. I wrote the first proposal, built the operational model, calculated the budgets, and presented it to the board myself. After the meeting, Richard pulled me aside, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "If Helios gets approved, you'll lead it, I promise." I didn't just hear it, I believed every word. For the next 6 months, I lived for that project. No vacations, constant travel, supplier meetings, risk plans, every detail handled as if my future depended on it, because it did. Then I started noticing small changes. Richard left early more often. He mentioned an old name, Charles Brooks. I heard they were college friends, and that Brooks was considering a major investment in Helios. At first, I was glad. The project needed capital. If Brooks funded it, we could finally move forward. But soon the rumors started. Charles had a son, fresh out of Stanford's MBA program, looking for a real-world opportunity. And apparently, Richard and Charles had been seeing a lot of each other, mostly on the golf course, where million-dollar deals are sealed with a handshake and a smile. I didn't think much of it until one morning, during an internal meeting, Richard announced a strategic restructuring of the Helios team. He said the project needed a new generation of leadership, dynamic, creative, unbound by old patterns. The room went silent. A few glances drifted my way, then quickly turned elsewhere. I didn't react. I just sat there quietly, but inside, something cracked. That night, I stayed in the office longer than usual. Outside the glass windows, Chicago was covered in snow. I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring at the scattered city lights, and thought about Richard's words. One day, you'll be in the executive suite. Maybe that day would never come. What I didn't know was that while I still believed in fairness, somewhere on a golf course, a decision had already been made, and I was about to become expendable in the very thing I'd built. I turned off the lights, gathered my thick Helios files, and whispered to myself, 8 years. I've always believed good work speaks for itself. Maybe it's time I learned to speak for it. Across town, Richard Mason was raising a glass with his old friend. They talked about Helios, about the future, and about bringing Evan, Brooks's son, into the company as a promising start for both sides. I had no idea that my future had just been traded away with a perfect swing of a golf club. I don't know if you've ever been in my place, working hard, believing in a promise, only to realize one day that everything can be decided in a meeting you weren't even invited to. Maybe you have. Maybe you're living that moment right now, quietly doing your best, hoping your effort will be seen. If so, tell me where you're listening from. Maybe it's a small office, a late night commute, or your car on the way home. I want to know, because somewhere in this story, maybe there's a part of you too. And if you love stories about awakening, about ordinary people who rise and reclaim their worth, hit follow. Because what happens after that golf swing is only the beginning. When the new week began, something felt different in the office. The whispers in the hallways, the closed-door calls, the half-smiles Richard Mason gave to passing executives, it all signaled one thing: something was about to happen. I'd been in the corporate world long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. Richard had his own brand of silence. He didn't lie outright, he just chose which truths not to tell. That Monday morning, I was reviewing the Helios project timeline when Richard's assistant knocked on my door. Carter, the boss wants to see you in the 10th floor conference room. I walked in and saw Richard standing beside an older man with silver hair, a practiced smile, and the sharp, measuring eyes of someone used to control. Charles Brooks. I'd seen his face before, framed in old photos lining the company's honor wall. Richard gestured toward him. Amelia, I'm sure you've heard me mention Charles before. He's an old friend, and the key investor for our next phase. I shook Charles's hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm, the kind that tells you exactly who thinks he's in charge. Pleasure to finally meet you, Amelia, he said. I've heard plenty about you, the woman who's kept Mason and Hartwell running smooth all these years. I smiled politely, though one question burned quietly in my mind. Why was he here, in a meeting about Helios? Richard continued, his tone smooth. Charles is considering a substantial investment for Phase 2 of Helios, and will be adding new personnel to support the strategy team. His son, Evan Brooks, just graduated from Stanford. I think this would be a great opportunity for him to learn. I nodded slightly, keeping my face neutral, but inside, something tightened. It wasn't about having a new team member, it was about the way Richard said it, so casually, as if someone could walk into the project I'd built from scratch and claim a piece of it without question. That afternoon, Evan arrived. Young, confident, wearing a suit so new it still held the tailor's creases. When introduced, he flashed a bright smile. You're the one my dad says this place couldn't survive without, right? It's an honor to learn from you. I smiled faintly. I just do my job. Think of this as your real-world classroom. For the first few weeks, I trained him. He was smart, or at least knew how to sound like it. But what Evan lacked was experience. He talked about disruptive thinking and innovative frameworks, while what we needed was reliability and precision. Stability, not another MBA presentation. I corrected his proposals more than once, but he only laughed. Sometimes you've got to take risks to stand out, he said. I replied quietly, in logistics, standing out isn't always good, especially when it costs millions in errors. What stood out more than Evan's inexperience was Richard's indulgence. He invited Evan to executive meetings, seated him beside major clients, places I used to lead. During one strategy session, Richard turned mid-discussion and said, Evan, I'd like your take on this. Young people like you understand the market better than anyone. The room went still. I didn't react, but inside I felt the ground shift. I was watching myself being replaced in a game I never agreed to play. A few days later, I got an internal notice. Evan Brooks was added to Helios Project Access. Full editing permissions. I reread it twice. My hands went cold. No one asked for my approval. No one even thought it was necessary. Not long after, I overheard a conversation through a half-closed door. Richard and Charles. "I don't want promises, Richard," Charles said, his voice low and steady. "If I put in $15 million, my son needs a guaranteed role." Richard chuckled. "You know I treat Evan like family. He'll have a place, not just in Helios, but in the company's future." That sentence cut sharper than anything I'd heard in my career. It was confirmation. Every move, every smile, every meeting had already been arranged. Over the following weeks, the shift became visible. Colleagues started laughing louder at Evan's jokes, praising his shallow insights like they were visionary. I didn't fight it, I just observed. When people believe power has changed hands, they forget who actually keeps the lights on. One afternoon, while I was preparing the project report, Richard called me into his office. He spoke gently, almost kindly. "Amelia, I know you've noticed some changes. Don't let it distract you. Evan's here to learn. Think of yourself as his mentor." I met his eyes. "I've done my job for 8 years, Richard. I'm not a mentor. I'm the one holding this project together while he learns." He paused, then smiled that calm, dismissive smile. "I trust you'll handle this professionally." I left without another word, but something inside me settled. Not anger, not despair, but clarity. Once money and connections take over, merit becomes optional. And if I wanted to survive, I had to start thinking like them. That night, I sat in front of my computer, staring at the operational blueprint I'd built from the ground up. Every line of code, every contract, every workflow bore my fingerprints. And I realized something. What kept Mason and Hartwell running wasn't prestige or legacy. It was people like me, the ones they called replaceable. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid, because I knew if they ever decided to cut me out, they'd pay for it. And as I've learned over the years, when the game starts changing its rules, you just have to play it better than they do. The first Monday of the month came with a strange kind of excitement. Posters lined every hallway, each one shouting the same slogan: "Helios, a new era of growth." I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, caught somewhere between pride and unease. Helios had been my creation. I wrote its first lines on a wrinkled sheet of paper late one night, back when no one believed this company could expand beyond the Midwest. And now it had become the pride of Mason and Hartwell, a shining symbol of progress. No one seemed to remember who started it. For 3 straight months, my team and I worked late into the night to prepare for the launch. Every route, every supplier, every line of code in the logistics software, nothing escaped my review. Meanwhile, Evan was appearing more often beside Richard. They attended strategy meetings together, posed for photos at internal events, even did interviews for the company newsletter. Every time I saw one of those photos, I no longer felt anger, just emptiness. That Friday afternoon, an internal email arrived titled Helios Project, Progress Update. In the recipient list, Evan's name was listed first. I opened the attachment. In the notes section, one line stopped me cold. Evan Brooks, Strategic Project Coordinator. A new title. No one had mentioned it to me. I read it 3 times, then just sat there in silence. It was all happening quietly, step by step, while I was still the one keeping the gears from falling apart. The following Monday, Richard called a full executive meeting. When I walked in, the atmosphere was tense. No casual chatter, just a heavy kind of anticipation. On the screen at the center of the room was a slide titled Helios Expansion, Leadership Alignment. Evan sat across from me, white shirt, blue tie, a practiced smile. I said nothing. Richard began, voice upbeat. "We are standing at the most defining moment in the company's history. Helios will take Mason and Hartwell to the national level, and to achieve that, I'd like to introduce the new leadership team. All eyes turned toward him. He paused for effect, then said, Evan Brooks will serve as head of strategic development, overseeing the entire Helios rollout. The room fell silent. I heard the faint clatter of a pen dropping somewhere in the back. A few people glanced my way, then quickly looked down. I stayed calm. Richard continued, Amelia Carter will remain in charge of operations, ensuring stability in our current systems. In other words, I was out. Evan stood up to speak. I'm truly honored to contribute to this milestone project. I've learned so much from Ms. Carter, and I believe together we'll lead this company into a new era. I smiled faintly and nodded, though inside everything had gone still. When the meeting ended, I waited until everyone else left before gathering my notes. Richard was still there, pretending to check his phone. He looked up and smiled. Thought you up. Understand, don't you, Carter? It's just a strategic move. I need to give the younger generation a chance. I replied evenly, Strategic, yes, but maybe you've forgotten who wrote that strategy. He hesitated, then said, You're still a key part of the team. Don't let this get to you. I nodded, turned to leave. Behind me, his voice softened. Sometimes to move forward, we have to take a step back. Without turning around, I said, I've stepped back enough. The next day, the changes became more visible. Meeting invites started arriving for me last. Strategy sessions turned into private working lunches I was no longer invited to. Evan began signing off on project memos, even the ones I'd written. One afternoon, a junior staffer brought me a printed document. Ms. Carter, this one's from Mr. Evan, right? He asked. I glanced at it. It was my plan, just with his name at the top. I smiled. Yes, it is now. That evening, I opened an old email folder. There it was, a message from Richard 2 years ago. Carter, when the time comes, the regional director position will be yours. I trust you completely. I read it once more, then deleted it without hesitation. In the days that followed, Evan began presenting new proposals to the board. I sat in the back, listening. He spoke smoothly, confidently, throwing out buzzwords like data optimization, digital transformation, and agile supply chain frameworks. Heads nodded as if these were revelations, though I'd said the same things for 3 years. When he finished, Richard clapped first. The rest followed. I stayed still, my hand resting on a file folder, my chest cold and hollow. That night, I stayed late at the office. The building was quiet, bathed in dim yellow light. Papers scattered across my desk reflected faintly against the window. I sat there watching the city lights flicker below. No anger, no pain, just silence. I realized I had believed too long that fairness was the natural order of things, that being good and capable was enough to protect me. But the world doesn't run on fairness. It runs on leverage. I opened my laptop and looked at the operational network map I had built. Every supplier, every contract, every process tied to my name, my signature. And in that moment, one thought crystallized. They could take my title, but not my knowledge, or the control embedded in the systems I designed. I closed the laptop, leaned back, and whispered to myself, if they want a game, I'll play. But this time, I'll write the rules. Downstairs, laughter echoed from the small party celebrating Helios's new milestone. Evan was probably there, raising a glass beside Richard. I checked the clock, 9 p.m. As always, I was the one left behind to clean up after the celebration I wasn't invited to. But this time, I didn't feel sad. I just saw everything clearly. The storm hadn't arrived yet. It was still forming, and I, Amelia Carter, was going to be the one to steer the wind. That Monday morning, the office didn't feel like the same place. From the lobby, I could already see people decorating tables, arranging pastries and premium coffee, the kind Mason and Hartwell only brought out when there was news big enough to disguise as celebration. And sure enough, the giant lobby screen confirmed it. Helios leadership announcement. The future begins today. I stared at it, unease pressing deep in my chest. After 8 years here, I had learned how to translate the company's language. When they said the future, they usually meant someone's about to be replaced. At exactly 9, the executive meeting began. Every department head was there. I sat in my usual second row seat, close enough to see, far enough to be forgotten. Richard Mason entered, looking more alive than I'd seen him in months. Navy suit, red tie, the same color he always wore when he was about to make a big announcement. Behind him followed Evan Brooks, wearing almost the same outfit, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of nerves. Richard stood before the projection screen and began in his confident, rehearsed tone. Ladies and gentlemen, today marks a defining moment for Mason and Hartwell. We're stepping into a new chapter, one built on innovation, youth, and vision beyond our old limits. The Helios project will be the foundation of this new era. He paused, scanning the room. Then, slowly and deliberately, he said, I'm proud to announce that, as of today, Evan Brooks will serve as Project Director of Helios, leading our strategic expansion nationwide. The room froze. I heard a sharp inhale from somewhere in the back, followed by the faint clink of a pen hitting the table. Evan stood, smiling awkwardly, clearly still processing the title he'd just been handed. He gave a few trembling lines about new vision, leadership trust, and the company's next frontier, sounding like a student reading from flashcards. I sat still. No expression. Inside, everything shattered and yet felt painfully clear. Months of sleepless nights, thousands of lines edited, countless crises fixed, all reduced to a handshake, a smile, and polite applause. When Evan finished, a few hesitant claps echoed through the room. I joined them. 3 quiet taps, polite and precise, enough to look composed. Richard smiled, satisfied. He didn't look at me once. The meeting ended. Groups formed quickly, voices low, laughter forced. Some people avoided my eyes. Others congratulated Evan, their words hollow and practiced. I gathered my papers slowly, keeping my breathing even, though my hands trembled slightly. As I turned to leave, Richard called out behind me, Amelia, wait a second. I stopped. The room was empty now, just the two of us. He took off his glasses, stepped closer, voice lowering into that tone of fake warmth I'd heard too many times. I know this surprised you, he said, but trust me, it's for the best. Evan brings new energy, a fresh perspective. You're still essential, of course, but now we need someone who can drive the strategic vision. I looked him in the eye. My voice was calm, steady. So 8 years of experience isn't considered vision? He hesitated, then smiled weakly. You know what I mean, Carter. You're the foundation, and he's the one building the future. You both matter. I replied without blinking. I built the foundation. But if the walls go up in the wrong direction, the whole house will fall. For a moment, he said nothing. His expression faltered, then he straightened up, regaining his authoritative tone. I trust you'll stay professional. Don't let emotions cloud your judgment. I nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood alone in the hallway, lights reflecting off the polished floor. I felt like I'd just watched the quiet death of something I used to believe in. Not anger, not sorrow, just an emptiness so deep it echoed. The kind that comes when you've spent years building a bridge, only to be told you're not worthy to cross it. That night, I stayed late. The office was dark, the glow of my monitor painting faint light across the files stacked on my desk. I opened the folder that held the first Helios draft, the one I'd written from scratch. Every number, every clause, every fixed error carried my fingerprints. But now, my name was gone from every report. I leaned back, breathing slowly. In my mind, I saw Richard and Charles Brooks on the golf course, laughing, shaking hands, and then Evan, the man with new energy. If they thought I'd accept this quietly, they had underestimated me. I wasn't the type to endure forever. I was the type who waited for the right moment to strike back. I opened a new folder and typed the name, Helios Internal, Legal Access Draft. Then I began reviewing each contract, every legal clause. I knew the agreements I'd signed with suppliers, lines of text no one else understood, leverage buried deep in the fine print. I knew where the pressure points were, the kind that could freeze an entire operation if pulled. By the time the clock hit 11, I saved the final document and closed the laptop. I stood, looking around the silent office. Outside, rain fell against the glass, soft but relentless. They want to play, I whispered. Fine, but I'll be the one writing the rules. I turned off the lights. The room went dark except for the faint glow of the building across the street. Inside me, there was a strange calm, like the still surface of a lake right before a storm, because I knew, when morning came, nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, something in me changed. I no longer worked with the eagerness of someone trying to prove her worth. I worked with the precision of someone who knows she's in a war, and that victory doesn't come from noise, but from silence at the right moment. I started arriving at the office earlier than anyone else, so early that the lights hadn't even switched on. People thought I was trying to move past the shock, trying to appear normal. But I wasn't recovering. I was preparing for something no one would see coming. I began collecting data, not company secrets, but everything that fell within my responsibility. Contracts, partnership clauses, transaction records, system access logs, supplier communications. Every file, every email, I copied into my personal drive. I wasn't stealing. I was preserving what 8 years of my labor had built. And when I reviewed it all, I noticed something fascinating. In at least 12 of the major supplier contracts I'd negotiated, my name was listed as the exclusive point of contact between Mason and Hartwell and those vendors. That meant no request, amendment, or approval would be valid without my authorization. No one else's. Not Evans, not Richard's, just mine. I remembered the first deal I'd ever signed, with North Axis, our most critical supplier. Richard hadn't even bothered to read the agreement. He'd simply said, "Go ahead and sign it, Carter. I trust you." Those words, now, were the sweetest form of irony I'd ever known. I kept working as usual, maybe even more cheerful than before. I laughed just enough, nodded when expected, and no one suspected that inside me, a plan was taking shape. Evan still stopped by my office to ask absurdly simple questions like, "Hey, how do I check cross-regional supply synchronization?" I'd smile, explain, and even draft a written process for him. But every time he left, I'd jot a note in my private log, small details he'd inevitably mess up once I was gone. A week later, Richard summoned me to his office. He sat behind his desk, still trying to look composed, but his eyes were searching. "Carter, I know you're not happy," he began, "but don't let this affect your work. I need you to focus on supporting Evan during the transition." I stayed silent, letting him finish. He continued, "You're experienced. You understand Helios better than anyone. Treat this as an opportunity to show leadership. Don't turn yourself into someone bitter." I smiled faintly. "I'm working as I always have, sir, but I don't believe someone needs to prove leadership by training their replacement." He froze for a second. I met his eyes and went on. "I've learned the most important lesson Mason and Hartwell could ever teach me, that a person's value isn't determined by their ability, but by their connections. Thank you for that. It helped me see things clearly." Richard's expression hardened. "Careful, Carter. I hope you haven't forgotten who gave you your start here." "I remember," I said evenly. "And I also remember who took advantage of it." His jaw tightened. "You don't want to destroy your own career. This company may be small compared to the world out there, but its reputation isn't. I can help you, or make sure you struggle to find another place." I stood, voice calm. "I don't plan on destroying myself, Mr. Mason. I just plan on stopping others from destroying my work." Then I walked out, leaving him silent for once. For the first time, I saw the confidence drain from his face. He knew I wasn't bluffing. From that day on, I worked with an almost surgical detachment. I finished pending processes, signed off on key documents, and quietly sent formal notices to all suppliers, reminding them that any transaction related to Helios required my personal approval within the next 30 days, per contractual policy. I wasn't sabotaging anything, I was just enforcing the rules. Evan began to look uneasy. He came to my desk more often, confused about why certain requests weren't getting approved. I explained kindly, adding, "That's the policy. You'll need to route it through me." He'd nod, thank me, still puzzled, never realizing this was only the opening move. That weekend, I stayed late at the office, watching the city lights flicker beyond the glass. I knew Richard would soon try to push me out, but the thought no longer scared me. I was ready. I had the data, the authority, and, most of all, the calm he never expected. I opened my notebook and wrote one simple line. When people start believing they can't lose, that's when they lose everything. I closed it, turned off the lights, and left. Richard thought he'd sidelined me, but he didn't realize that in the silence he'd forced on me, I was quietly reclaiming every piece of power he'd underestimated. The next morning, I passed Evan in the hallway. He smiled politely, the way young professionals do when they still think the world plays fair. I nodded back, watching him walk away. In my mind, one thought echoed clearly. He wasn't my enemy. He was just a pawn placed on the wrong square, and I, the player they'd pushed off the board, was about to make the entire game collapse with one single move. 3 weeks after Evan's appointment was announced, everything at Mason and Hartwell appeared to be running exactly according to Richard's plan, at least on the surface. Internal emails from communications praised Helios, a monumental step in our national strategy. Company articles showed photos of Evan shaking hands with investors, captioned with phrases like, "The spirit of innovation, the youth of Mason and Hartwell." I read every word without anger, without bitterness. Everything was unfolding just as I expected, along the path I had quietly mapped out. Beneath the surface, though, the system had started to fracture, tiny cracks spreading quietly, irreversibly. Evan, despite his forced confidence, was beginning to stumble. He didn't understand the workflows, couldn't grasp the delicate network of supplier relationships, and, most importantly, had no legal authority over the contracts I had personally bound with my signature. By Monday, the purchasing department reported that a major shipment was on hold because North Axis refused to process the order. Within minutes, Evan appeared at my door, clutching a stack of papers. "Ms. Carter, they said they need your confirmation before moving forward." I glanced at the documents and said calmly, "That's correct. The contract specifies that all North Axis transactions require my written authorization until a legally approved transfer takes place." But, he hesitated, anxious. "We're in the expansion phase. They said if it's not resolved in 48 hours, the supply chain will stall." I looked him straight in the eye, my voice steady. "Then tell them I haven't received a valid transfer request." He stood there for a moment, nodded, and forced a polite smile. "Right. I'll let them know." When he left, I didn't smile. I didn't sigh. I simply wrote one quiet note in my journal. Step 1, Clause 4A in effect. 2 days later, the inbound logistics system stalled again. This time, Fulcrum Dynamics refused to deliver the trial shipment, citing the Quality Guarantee Clause under Amelia Carter's supervision. I knew this would happen. I'd added that clause myself to prevent liability risks, and now it was doing exactly what it was designed to do: freeze operations the moment my authorization disappeared. Re-signing those agreements could take weeks, maybe months. Richard started to panic. A former colleague told me he'd called an emergency meeting with the legal team demanding a full contract review, but everything was airtight. Every clause I'd written was legitimate, approved, and archived. His only problem? He'd never actually read what he signed. By the 4th week, rumors began to spread. Department heads whispered that Helios was stuck, that Evan couldn't execute, that suppliers were asking for Carter. I overheard my own name in passing conversations as I walked through the hall. I didn't stop, I just smiled faintly and kept walking. One afternoon, while finishing my monthly report, the desk phone rang. "Carter, are you free?" Richard's voice, low and strained. "I'm listening." "I need you in my office, now." When I entered, he was standing by the window, shoulders slightly slumped. The air around him felt heavier, stripped of the arrogance that used to fill every room he entered. "Sit down," he said, softer than usual. "We're facing a few minor issues with Helios," he began. "Some suppliers are slow to respond. I'm told a few contracts require your authorization. I assume there's been some misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, sir, I replied evenly. All terms were approved and filed. If needed, I can provide copies. He narrowed his eyes, forcing a tone of calm diplomacy. You know I don't want trouble. If you cooperate, everything will return to normal quickly. I'll make sure your contributions are properly recognized. I studied him for a long moment. What kind of cooperation do you need from me? He paused, then said, just a temporary authorization. Sign off once so Evan can process the pending orders. That's all I'm asking. I tilted my head slightly, my voice gentle, but my eyes sharp. I'm afraid I can't do that. You know the rules. All transfers must go through legal. If I signed temporarily, I'd be violating the very contract I created. Silence. I watched his jaw tighten, his hand curl into a fist against the desk. What are you doing, Carter? He said, voice low and tense. What are you trying to prove? Nothing, I said softly. Just following the compliance policy you once praised me for. The silence in that room was so heavy, I could hear the second hand of the clock ticking behind me. Finally, he said, remember, I gave you everything. I stood, met his eyes, and replied, no, you gave me a chance. Everything else, I earned. And if you haven't realized it yet, you're about to learn something new about power. It doesn't live in the corner office. It lives in the hands of the person who can make the system stop. Then I turned and left without looking back. As I walked down the hall, I saw Evan speaking with the tech team, trying to appear composed. His face was pale. He didn't know it yet, but within a week, he'd be facing the real storm, when the entire network would grind to a halt over a single missing signature. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from someone in finance. North Axis has stopped shipping. Fulcrum's demanding new confirmation. They said they'll only deal with you. Mason's furious. Be careful. I typed back one short reply. I don't need to be careful. I just need to be patient. Outside my window, Chicago glowed under a cold wind sweeping through the glass. I whispered to myself, almost smiling. They wanted a lesson in innovation? Fine. But they're about to learn something far more important. Every empire has a limit, and theirs happens to have my name on it. 3 days later, the Helios system officially collapsed. Not in some cinematic explosion, but through a slow chain of tiny malfunctions that spread across the company like an incurable disease. It began with unanswered emails, unsigned purchase orders, and shipments stranded at ports because no one held the legal authority to clear them. Then came the suppliers, insisting they would only work with the original signatory, me. Evan couldn't intervene. Every access point he touched was blocked by the very system I had designed. By the end of the week, more than half of Helios's operations were frozen. Departments began to panic. Sales couldn't close deals because there was no product. Finance couldn't release payments because invoices were suspended. The tech team fielded endless calls from angry clients. And then, inevitably, came the all-hands emergency meeting. That morning, I entered the boardroom with everyone else. The air was thick and heavy. Richard sat at the head of the table, drumming his fingers, tension visible in every movement. Evan sat beside him, staring at his laptop, pale and sleepless. Richard began, trying to sound composed. We're experiencing a few operational challenges. I want everyone focused on solutions, not blame. A voice from the far end cut through the room. With all due respect, Mr. Mason, this isn't a minor challenge. We're losing $2.3 million a day because transactions can't be completed. Suppliers aren't responding, and from what I've heard, most contracts only accept authorization from Ms. Carter. Every head turned toward me. I stayed perfectly still. Richard's jaw tightened as he forced a calm tone. Ms. Carter, could you clarify this for us? I looked around the room, then spoke slowly. The contracts were signed legally, approved by the board. The exclusive point of contact clause was created to ensure stability, and it was signed by you, Mr. Mason. I'm simply following the rules. Someone interjected, irritated. So you're saying the entire system works only if you approve it? No, I replied evenly. I'm saying the system works if someone understands how it works. Silence. Evan flushed, his voice trembling slightly. We've tried coordinating, but some details aren't clear yet. Maybe you could help explain. I already sent all transition documents to legal, I said, voice calm but sharp. If they haven't shared them with you, perhaps you should ask the right person. Richard slammed his palm on the table. Carter, are you deliberately making this harder than it needs to be? This is our company. I met his gaze without flinching. No, this is your company. I just kept it running. And if it stops when I'm gone, maybe the problem isn't me. A few people fought back smiles. The truth had done its work. The meeting ended in suffocating silence. As everyone left, Richard told me to stay. He shut the door, his voice low but burning with anger. You're sabotaging me, aren't you? I said nothing. I know what you're doing, he continued. You want revenge. You want to see me fall. But I won't let you drag this company down over your ego. I rose slowly, my tone steady. Ego? No, Mr. Mason. I've simply stopped being the wall that absorbs your mistakes. And if the wall collapses, it's not the brick's fault. He scoffed, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. You think you've won? Fine. Let's see who's still standing when the dust settles. I nodded once. We will. That afternoon, I submitted my resignation. No lengthy explanation, no thank yous. Just 7 words. I resign, effective immediately. 30 minutes later, my phone rang. Richard. I didn't answer. He called again, then again. Finally, an email appeared. Carter, you're burying yourself. No one in this industry will touch someone who abandons ship mid-crisis. I'll make sure of it. I read it and smiled. That night, I sent a round of brief, professional emails to every partner and supplier I'd ever worked with, informing them of my departure from Mason and Hartwell and thanking them for their collaboration. Minutes later, the first reply came from Janet Lee, COO of North Axis. Amelia, if you plan to start your own firm or consult independently, we want to be your first client. Then came Fulcrum Dynamics, then others. They didn't need to know what had happened inside the company. They just knew that the person who kept everything running had left, and they wanted to follow her. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching Chicago's Black River shimmer with scattered lights. There was no anger left in me, no triumph either, just a quiet certainty. Tomorrow, when I was no longer at Mason and Hartwell, they'd finally understand the value of the presence they had taken for granted. I whispered to myself, tomorrow, they'll learn the lesson I learned too late. No one is truly irreplaceable, except the person they thought was easiest to replace. And they did. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment, brewed a cup of coffee, opened my laptop, and typed the first line of a new plan. Carter Consulting, Independent Logistics Strategy. I didn't need the old company. I just needed a new beginning, this time under my own name. I left Mason and Hartwell on a gray Monday morning in early March when Chicago still refused to let go of winter. There was no farewell, no company-wide email. I simply placed my badge on the receptionist's desk, walked out, and listened to the soft click of the revolving door behind me. A clean, final punctuation mark. That morning, I sat in a small cafe on Dearborn Street, opened my laptop, and began sending my first emails to former partners. I wrote simply, Hello, this is Amelia Carter. I've left Mason and Hartwell and am now offering independent consulting in supply chain strategy. If your company needs assistance, I'd be happy to collaborate. Within 2 hours, my inbox was overflowing. North Axis requested a virtual meeting that very afternoon. Fulcrum Dynamics wanted help auditing their internal logistics system. Even Hexler Group, the most demanding client Mason and Hartwell ever had, asked if I'd be available for an exclusive 3-month consultation. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the realization that, for the first time in 8 years, I didn't need anyone's permission to do what I did best. 3 weeks later, Carter Consulting was officially registered. I rented a modest office in an old downtown building, just enough space for 3 people, myself, a newly graduated assistant, and a young analyst who had once worked beside me at Mason and Hartwell. We had no logo, no fancy conference room, but we had something most corporations had long lost: our clients' trust. Every day, a new contract arrived. Not because we were cheaper, but because people wanted to work with someone who replied to emails at 2 a.m., someone who didn't say, "Let me check," when things broke, but "I'll fix it now." Word spread quickly. Within a month, I was consulting for 5 major companies. Growth came so fast it almost scared me. Meanwhile, Mason and Hartwell was in free fall. News began leaking out, suppliers refusing to cooperate, projects falling behind schedule, and their largest client, Hexler Group, issuing a formal warning about reviewing future collaboration viability. I didn't seek that information, but people sent it anyway, quietly, as if to say that justice was slowly finding its way home. One afternoon, Janet Lee from North Axis called. "Amelia," she said, her voice bright with amusement. "They called me this morning. Richard Mason wants to reinstate the old contract. I told him plainly, we only work with people who solve problems, not the ones who create them." I laughed softly. "I'm guessing that didn't go over well." Janet chuckled. "No, but it was the truth. They've been lost since you left." After the call ended, I sat by the window, watching the sunset spill gold across the river. I didn't feel triumphant, just lighter, because finally the right things had found their proper place. But it wasn't over yet. A week. Later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but instinct made me answer. The voice on the other end was low, familiar. "Amelia, it's Richard." I paused a few seconds before replying. "I know." He inhaled sharply. "I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling to discuss business. We're in trouble with Helios. Suppliers aren't cooperating. Clients are threatening to pull out. I thought, maybe you could help." I let him speak, then asked gently, "Help how?" "You could come back, just temporarily. Advise Evan, stabilize the system. I know things ended badly, but think about the company, about the people losing their jobs." His voice carried sincerity, but I knew better. That wasn't regret, it was desperation. "I'm not coming back, Richard," I said. "I didn't leave out of anger. I left because I didn't belong there anymore. But if you need my help, we can discuss a consulting contract." Silence stretched on the line before he asked quietly, swallowing pride, "How much?" I opened my notebook, wrote a few quick notes, then said, 300,000 for 3 months, paid up front, no negotiation, and all Helios-related authority comes through me. Richard said nothing. The line went still for so long, I thought he'd hung up. Then, hoarse, he answered, "Send the proposal. I'll review it." "I'm not sending a proposal," I replied. "I'll send a contract. If you sign, I'll start immediately." We ended the call without saying goodbye. 10 minutes later, I sent the contract. 30 minutes after that, the payment hit my account, along with a short email that read, "Consider this our retainer." I stared at that line for a long time. No bitterness, no satisfaction. Just the quiet knowledge that a circle had finally closed. 3 days later, I walked back into Mason and Hartwell's headquarters. Not as an employee, but as the independent consultant they were now paying to listen to. As I entered the lobby, heads turned. Some faces showed surprise, others avoided eye contact. Across the room, Evan stood by the wall. Our eyes met. He gave a small nod, the nod of someone who knew that balance had been restored. I walked straight into the boardroom, where Richard and the executives were waiting. He looked older, his voice rougher. When he saw me, he stood and offered his hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. I shook it firmly. "You're welcome. Let's fix what you broke." For a second, the room froze. Then, as I began presenting my recovery plan, the tension dissolved. No interruptions, no doubts. Because for the first time they understood, the woman they had dismissed wasn't just a good employee. She was the foundation they had torn down, and now had to pay to rebuild. The meeting ended after 3 hours. As I stepped into the hallway, Evan approached quietly. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to do this." I smiled. "I'm not doing it for them, Evan. I'm doing it for the people still fighting to keep their jobs, and for myself. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's making them pay to watch you succeed." Evan nodded, eyes full of respect. I walked away through the brightly lit corridor, feeling the invisible line I'd just crossed, from being underestimated to being indispensable. My story wasn't over, but at that moment I knew I had won. Not through anger, but through the calm certainty of someone who finally knew her own worth. 3 months later, Mason and Hartwell was no longer the empire people once spoke of with reverence. Helios, Richard's golden child, the project he flaunted to every investor in the financial circuit, now existed somewhere between life and death. And yet, thanks to the recovery plan I'd put in place, the company was still standing. Barely, but standing nonetheless. I hadn't saved them. I'd saved the people who still believed in their work, the operations staff, the tech teams, the ones who stayed up through the night fixing small errors no one would ever thank them for. They deserve that chance, not the ones who signed plans they never read and called it leadership. The final meeting of my consulting contract took place on a Friday morning. I arrived on time, as always, carrying a near 100-page report. The conference room was bright with sunlight, but the air no longer held that heavy tension of my first days back. Evan sat in the corner, taking careful notes. Richard looked older, thinner, weary, the kind of tired that sits deep behind the eyes. The look of a man who'd spent years giving orders, now forced to listen. I presented the last of my findings, my voice calm, without pride. With these adjustments to the supply chain model and personnel restructuring, Helios can stabilize within 6 months. But that depends on whether leadership has the courage to change. I can't decide that for you. I can only offer a path. Silence filled the room. Then Richard nodded slowly. "Thank you, Amelia. We've had our differences, but I have to admit, without you, Mason and Hartwell wouldn't still exist." I met his eyes, steady. "No one wants the company to fall, Richard, but every empire pays a price when it forgets its foundation." He lowered his gaze. For a moment, I didn't see the arrogant CEO I once worked under, just a man realizing how much he'd lost. Maybe he finally understood. Power without respect is just a sandcastle waiting for the tide. When the meeting ended, Evan came over to shake my hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know I was put in the wrong place. I don't want to end up like him." I smiled faintly. "You still have a chance to do what's right. Don't fear starting over. Just make sure this time you know the difference between reputation and competence." He nodded, his eyes clearer than when we first met. I knew he'd leave soon, to find his own way. That was the best thing he could do. I left the room and walked down the long hallway I'd crossed 1,000 times, feeling as if I were moving between two lives, one past, one present. At the end of the corridor, Janet Lee was waiting. She smiled and handed me an envelope. "We just signed a new regional strategy contract with Carter Consulting. 6 months. Congratulations, Amelia." I smiled back. "Thank you, Janet. I think it's time I build something that truly carries my name." She touched my shoulder lightly. "You already have." That afternoon, I left the Mason and Hartwell building for the last time. No crowd, no spotlight, just me, stepping out into the cold air where the scent of coffee and wind mixed in the streets. I stopped to glance up at the company's logo, a symbol of 8 years of work, patience, and the naive belief that effort alone would always be enough. Now I understood. Sometimes you have to let something collapse to finally see your own worth. That evening, I sat in my small Carter consulting office, watching city lights ripple against the glass. My phone buzzed. A new email. It was from Richard Mason, just one line. "Thank you for not destroying us, and good luck." I read it, smiled, and typed back, "Thank you for teaching me the most expensive lesson of my career. Never hand your value to someone else." I hit send, closed my laptop, and poured another cup of coffee. Outside, Chicago gleamed, alive, indifferent, unaware that a silent war had just ended. No blood, no explosions, only clarity and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to vanish. I stood, opened my notebook, and wrote on the first page, "Success doesn't come from being seen. It comes from knowing exactly when to walk away." Then I whispered, almost like a promise to myself, "This battle's over. Time to build my own empire." And if you're hearing this, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly replaced, remember this. Your worth doesn't depend on who sees it. It depends on whether you're brave enough to stand up and prove they were wrong. Tell me where you're listening from. Maybe it's an office, a late night drive home, or a quiet moment when you're wondering if all your effort still matters. And if you've ever thought about giving up, don't. Wait until the ending. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making someone fail, it's watching them finally admit that you've already won.